my life. For all your precious gifts, receive my gratefulness.
MBM, when we were there, used to say at the front of every talk, just give me a wave if you can hear me up the back there. Sorry? That's not important, you don't have to write that down. Right? Exactly. Alright. As I said last night, we're going to talk a little bit about Old Testament ethics and how we might approach that. So what we've got today is not 3 sermons particularly, but more 3 kind of reflections of what someone else has done. And I'm going to work through kind of a summary of what they've done with you in the hope that it will be helpful. And if you don't find it helpful or interesting, well, talk to Simon because he asked me to talk. So, but people often find ethics boring, depressing, or terrifying. So writes the author of a book on ethics, Andrew Cameron. He says they're bored when people start throwing around words like complexity and reductionist rather than just being practical. He says it's depressing when ethics seems to be more about what we do wrong than what we do right. He says it's terrifying when you suddenly find yourself in a rapidly developing and unfolding real-time situation and you don't know what the right thing is to do. And I think that's especially true when we think about our Old Testament and reading our Old Testament and the ethics we find in the Old Testament. Because kind of compared with the Gospels and particularly with the New Testament letters, the books of the Old Testament, the customs of the people described in it, the laws that are given to them, they all just seem so distant and so foreign to us, and also so open to mockery from those who want to malign it. Right? And so you might have heard something before, in fact I'm fairly sure you would have, someone saying, well, you know, you Christians, you want to claim that homosexuality is bad because Leviticus says so, but in the same chapter of Leviticus it says you can't wear polyester and you can't eat shellfish, and yet I saw you eating prawns, but you think you've got a problem with my gay friend. Or, what do we make as Christians of those Old Testament laws? And there are quite a number of them that command capital punishment for some kind of transgression. Or what about those weird regulations that say that a pregnant woman is ceremonially unclean for having a child, right? Because there's all that stuff about blood, that's it. But she's ceremonially unclean for twice as long if the child is a girl than if it's a boy. Alright? I'm not going to explain any of these, by the way, you just deal with them. But, or that Israelites could keep slaves. You know, there's often talk about slavery, but they couldn't keep Israelite slaves. Right? So what do we do with those things? And I think we've had such a hard time understanding exactly what we should do with the instructions in the Old Testament that Christians have kind of moved towards 2 poles of a spectrum. That is, and we'll exaggerate them for effect, but you'll recognise them. We either say the Old Testament law is God's word, and it's God's forever word, and God is unchanging, and therefore whatever is written in the Old Testament, we ought to obey. And so not long ago, we had someone in our congregation who, to what the best of their ability, I guess, tried to do those kind of things. Or we go the other way and we say Christian ethics springs from Jesus, not from the Old Testament, and it has very little, if anything, to say about the way we live now. So our 2 poles are kind of either the law fully applies to us or none of the Old Testament law applies to us. And you'll find yourself somewhere on that spectrum. But laws are there to help us know how to live, right? laws that guide the way we live in the world. And ethics is basically our thinking about how we should live. Ethics describes how we think about right and wrong, and good and evil. It describes our thoughts and our feelings about right and wrong behaviours and right and wrong conditions. To say that is a bad thing to do, or this is a good way to be. So take a law like do not murder, for example. I want to work with the assumption that everyone thinks that is a good law. Right? In the room, we all agree that not murdering anyone or not being murdered by anyone is a good thing. Murder ought not be committed. But why? Is it wrong because the 6th of the 10 Commandments says so? Is it wrong because, well, Jesus, that's not one of the laws that Jesus says, well, you don't have to do that anymore? Is it wrong for some other reason? I want you to ask someone around you for the next 15, 20 seconds, if that law is a good law, if it's a right law to have, why? Why is it good? Why is it right? 20 seconds. Go. Alright, like I said, I'm not going to answer your questions. And what I want to do over these talks is leave a whole lot of things open-ended so that we actually get a chance to discuss them afterwards. And tonight when you sit around the fire and you think, oh, but what about this? Or I read this last week and this it doesn't make any sense anymore. Tom broke it. Help me fix it. Right? No. So I'll tell you a joke instead. There's a joke that goes, there's a professor of ethics or moral thinking who's asked to describe the different approaches to ethics taken by different countries, particularly in Europe and potentially following one of the wars. And he said, you might understand it like this. In Germany, everything is prohibited except those things which are permitted. But in France, everything is permitted except those things which are prohibited. In Russia, everything is prohibited, including those things which are permitted. And in Italy, everything is permitted except the things that are, including the things that are prohibited. That's a bit of a gag, but everyone makes ethical decisions, right? Everyone has some idea or some collection of ideas that govern what we think is okay and what we think is not okay, both for ourselves and for others. And hopefully everyone has something consistent that underlies those ideas and binds them together. And they have good reasons for deciding which is right and which is wrong. That's doing ethics. That's the process of doing ethics. And there's lots of systems for doing ethics. And you might recognise some of these. You know, someone might say, well, I did my duty. I did what I would expect any right-thinking person to do in the same situation. They might have an ethic that is about seeking after a general set of requirements that apply to everyone. That everyone ought to meet this standard. Or someone might say, look, if we just respect each other's rights, everything else will follow on from there. Right? And they're chasing after the identification and the defence of some sort of universal set of rights, of values that everyone possesses. And they should be respected by everyone. I'm just going to mow right out here right now. A third person might say, look, if we apply the policy that we ought to seek the greatest good for the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, it will all be good. That's what we ought to do. This kind of quest for the best ends, sometimes irrespective of the means. Or somebody, and particularly a postmodern ethic that'll be, I think, very familiar is, it doesn't matter what you do to attain your own goals and personal happiness as long as no one else gets hurt. You can do whatever you want to be happy as long as you don't hurt anybody else. Particularly kind of post-modern ethics. So when we look at what the Old Testament says about ethics, what we're doing is considering what the writers and the compilers of the Old Testament, both the human and divine authors, saw as permitted and prohibited, as right and wrong, and trying to understand what their reasons were for deciding which is which. Because we're not just talking about laws, right? Carolyn, you can't hear because the mum. Does it shut? I don't know if it's going to help because, like, there's chicken wire all the way around the top. You might just have to chase them away. Just turn you up. Bigger than you, Tom. Sorry? Bigger than you. He's taller. I've been working on my dad bod.
You should die, Tom.
Yeah. So what we're doing is considering what the writers and compilers of the Old Testament, the human and divine authors, thought about right and wrong, what things were prohibited and permitted, and why they thought which was which, what reasons they had for deciding one way or the other. And that's true not just of the laws. When we talk about thinking about ethics and deciding what the ethics are, we're not just talking about the 613 laws that the Jews identified as being in the Old Testament. The poetry of the Old Testament says something about our beliefs in right and wrong. And the stories do. And even if the narrator of an account doesn't specifically tell you whether the action of the character was good or bad, there's enough hints in there for you to kind of understand what they thought and to make some decisions along those lines. They all contribute. So where do we start? Because it's a big book, right? Or a big collection of books. And that in itself has led to one of the problems of people doing Old Testament ethics and thinking about it, because you look at it and you go, oh man, I can't read and understand all of that. What I'll do is I'll pick out the bits that seem to support my point or my argument. The flip side being that someone who has an opposing viewpoint can do the same thing. Particularly when you look at Proverbs and it has things that are completely contradictory in chapters next to each other because it's talking about kind of wisdom. Right? So where do we start? Well, like I said earlier, what I'm going to do is present some material from a guy called Christopher Wright as a starting point. And his book is in my bag over there. I forgot to grab it when I came up, but you can see it if you want to. Chris Wright is an academic who specialises in Old Testament ethics and has been studying it for kind of 30 years. And his kind of research and his approach to thinking about the Old Testament and ethics is to think about it as a kind of triangle, or take an approach that he calls the ethical triangle. And a triangle has three angles, and he says, so for any passage or any subject you want to look at, you can look at the theological angle, that is what it says about God and how we understand who God is. You can think about the social angle, that is what it says about living together and about our relationships with others. And in his view, the nation of Israel is the key social element in the Old Testament. And you can think about the economic angle, that is, how does it talk about not only the way we use our money, but the way we set up our systems that govern life together. And for him, the primary economical part of the Old Testament is the land. So he's thinking about God and God's people and God's land, which sounds a lot like throwing Goldsworthy and Gospel of the Kingdom, if you ever remember looking at those things, God's people in God's place in God's land. It sounds like, looks a lot like that. But those are his three lenses, if you want, or three angles for looking inward at the Old Testament. And we're going to spend the remainder of this session thinking about the theological angle. How does it speak about, or how does the nature and character of Yahweh, the God of the Bible, how does it shape the ethics of the Old Testament? Who is this God who the first verses say created the heavens and earth? And to do that, we're going to look at a passage. So if you've got your Bible there, we're going to go to Deuteronomy chapter 4. Deuteronomy chapter 4. Moses is reciting or reading or presenting to Israel the law again before they enter the promised land. So they haven't yet gone in the land that God is giving them. We're going to start in verse 32. He says, I'm reading for the CSB, the Christian Standard Bible. It might be slightly different to what you've got, but follow along. And sometimes seeing where a word is different is good, because it forces us to ask questions about that. Why the translators picked that word instead of a different one. But he says, indeed, ask about the earlier times that preceded you, from the day God created mankind on the earth, from one end of the heavens to the other. Has anything like this great event ever happened? Or has anything like it been heard of? Has a people heard God's voice speaking from the fire as you have and lived? Or has a God attempted to go and take a nation as his own out of another nation by trials, signs, wonders, and war, by a strong hand and an outstretched arm, by great terrors, as the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? You were shown these things so that you would know that Yahweh is God. There is no other beside him. He let you hear his voice from heaven to instruct you. He showed you his great fire on earth, and you heard his words from the fire. And because he loved your ancestors, he chose their descendants after them, and he brought you out of Egypt by his presence and his great power to drive out before you the nations greater and stronger than you, and to bring you in, and to give you their land as an inheritance, as is now taking place. Today, recognize and keep in mind that the Lord is God, in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. Keep his statutes and commands, which I am giving you today, so that you and your children after you may prosper, and so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you for all time. It's a pretty important passage, this one, in Israel's kind of self-understanding and their understanding of God. And it comes to us not just as a passage, but a passage with a stated purpose. Like it tells us, Moses tells us why he's giving it to them. You see it there in verse 35. Having just reminded them of the Exodus event and of Mount Sinai and receiving the law, he then says, you were shown these things so that, there's your purpose clause, so that you would know that Yahweh is God. And it probably says the Lord in little capitals. That's just the way that that English translates that name of God that was given to him at the burning bush. 4 letters in Hebrew. I'm going to say Yahweh because that's kind of what non-English scholars accept, even though we don't know that that's how you would say it. It's just adding some vowels to some not vowels, consonants. But the Lord, these things were shown to you so that you would know that Yahweh is God, there is none beside him. And on one level it seems almost too simple to say, doesn't it, to point out. But that statement and others like it is the basis for theological thought in the Old Testament. That the God who revealed himself to Abraham is the one true God. The only God. And you would think, duh, isn't that obvious? But it wasn't always obvious to Israel, was it? By the time of the Exodus, you might ask yourself, well, what does Israel know about God? What does the average Israelite in slavery in Egypt understand about this God after 400 years in Egypt? With no Bible to read, oral traditions, a history with Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, stories passed down in generations. and faced with the might of Egypt, where they are held captive, with all the Egyptian gods with their weird animal heads and stuff, being trumpeted as, you are here because our gods are bigger than yours and better than yours. I want to give you another 20 seconds just to talk about, with the person, people around you, what do you think the average Israelite knew about their God before Moses came back from the wilderness? What do you think they knew? Alright, again, I'm not going to answer your questions. You can keep mulling over that, perhaps later on. But let's think about our Bible for a minute, those early books. For a document that is so often kind of caricatured as a book of rules, I think one of the things surprising is you don't get any real rules, any real laws until 70 chapters in. Right? You've got to get through 50 chapters of Genesis and then to Exodus 20 before you reach the 10 Commandments. There's a lot of setting up, right, in this story. There's a lot of prologue before you get to these. Lord, why? What has to happen before we get given instruction on ethical living? Well, in one sense, God has to show the people who He is. He has to show the people who He is. And He does it by His grace and His redeeming love, and only after those things are given and demonstrated are the people called to ethical living in response. So in the passage we read from Deuteronomy, I'm going to say that that's how Moses explains it to the people, isn't it? That's the order of the events as he presents them. God loves you, and therefore He demonstrated that love by redeeming you, by rescuing you out of the situation that you were in, by displaying to you His power and His grace in all those redeeming acts, by bringing you to Himself, by speaking to you and showing Himself, and then, and only then, does He make any ethical demands in light of those redemptive acts. So grace first, and then law, if you like. And there's no call to blind obedience in setting this framework up. It's not as if God comes and says, I'm your God, and therefore I have for you a bunch of arbitrary laws that you must obey. No, this is about relationship. I loved you, I saved you, I value you, I have made you mine. Therefore, here is how we're going to live together in a way in which everyone benefits. And we make those kind of covenants in our personal relationships. I think we think of this as kind of like, back by Israel and stuff, but we do the same thing. Our relationships probably don't involve miraculous rescues, or at least not from slavery, but we make those sort of agreements and arrangements in our marriages, in our families. We love each other. This is how we're going to have to live together, right, in order to make this work. They become our house rules. They become the ethics by which our relationships function. And the keeping or the violating of the rules determines whether or not the relationships succeed and continue, don't they? You know, I am Kaz, your wife, and you shall have no other women before me. Right? Rephrase one of those commandments. Right? There is ethical behaviour demanded of me because of her prior love. It's just like what we read. If there is a spider, you shall catch it and put it outside. Right? That's one of those ethical demands or that expected behaviour that comes out of, that's necessary for maintaining that relationship. So that I can go in to live long in the house that we have bought into. Right? We will both read the Bible and pray with our children. We will invest time and energy and money and relational capital into our church. We will give generously to charitable cause. You know, as a husband and a wife, we make these agreements together that come from that prior love. And those behaviours ought not to affect only the two of us, right? Our ethical decisions affect how we live as a family. They affect our children. They affect our faith community, our wider society. We have a face towards the world. And the relationship between Yahweh and Israel And the ethical decision-making of Israel also has a face towards the outside world, doesn't it? Like, so you'll remember it is part of God's plan. Genesis 12, you might want to flip back, Genesis 12, 1 to 3, it's a very famous passage, so you may even remember it. But in Genesis 12, God makes promises to Abraham, and here is the foundation from which Israel takes their beginning nation. But the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house, to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. And all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you." And so as laid out in these promises to Abraham, God says he's going to address the curse, the fallenness of humanity, through his relationship with one family, with one people, with one nation. He will work through that people for the blessing of the whole world. And we'll think a little bit more about the social angle next, but in part 2. But for now, it's enough to recognise that the ethical choices that Israel makes as they interact with each other in the wider world, they actually affect not only their relationship with God, but his purposes for the world. They are to be the means of his blessing to the nations, and so what they do as a people matters. But we'll leave that for talk 2, and we'll jump back to some of the foundational texts that help us understand the theological angle of our Old Testament ethics. We read from Deuteronomy 4, Genesis 12. Let's go to Exodus in the middle, Exodus chapter 6. So Exodus chapter 6, this is before the Exodus. Moses is repeating to the Israelite slaves in Egypt what Yahweh has told him to say. So we've had the burning bush, he's come to, or he's coming to them. So Exodus 6, verse 6. It says, "Therefore tell the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from the forced labour of the Egyptians and rescue you from slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and great acts of judgment. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. You will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from the forced labour of the Egyptians, and I will bring you to the land that I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord." And so how is Israel to know who Yahweh is, this God? It's through his rescue, isn't it? How are they to know? Through his rescue, through his delivery of them from slavery, through his love and grace. Because at the burning bush, there's no law. We're pre-Ten Commandments at this point in Exodus 6. As they live in Egypt, there's no law. They're not meriting God's favour in order that he should love or rescue them. God acted first. The Exodus comes first, and then Sinai. And so if you flip a few pages over to Exodus 19, this is the setup for the giving of the commandments in Exodus 19. We're setting up to hear the Ten Commandments. And in Exodus chapter 19, from verse 3, God says to Moses, "This is what you must say to the house of Jacob and explain to the Israelites. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." So grace first, rescue first. "Now, if you will carefully listen to me and keep my covenant, you will be my own possession out of all the peoples. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation. I carried you." It's almost like a footprints poem, isn't it? "I brought you to myself. So listen, keep my covenant, And you get to continue to be mine. My kingdom of priests, that is my representatives to the rest of the world. They didn't earn it or merit it. You might remember in Deuteronomy 7, it says that the Lord has set his heart on you and chosen you, not because you were more numerous than all the other people, for that you were the fewest of all people, but because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your ancestors, and he brought you out with a strong hand and redeemed you from the place of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So know that the Lord your God is God. Or, more directly, know that Yahweh, your God, is God, the faithful God who keeps his gracious covenant loyalty for 1,000 generations with those who love him and keep his commandments. And that is how the law begins, right? You're still in Exodus 19. If you flip to chapter 20, it's how the law begins. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. Do not have any other gods besides me. And you might be thinking, Tom, you keep saying the same thing. Look at 4 passages that all kind of say the same thing. Why? Boring. No, it's because the text says the same thing. Over and over and over it says to us, and if it keeps saying the same thing, it must be important, right? It must be important. The Old Testament law isn't arbitrary. It's not a means for us to attain favour. It's given in the context of a relationship in which God acted first and without coercion to redeem a people of his own with a purpose, through whom he could work to bless all the nations. See, God acts graciously and then he calls people to respond. And therefore, the people's response matters. Their ethical decision-making matters. Their view of what is right and wrong, what is good and what is evil. It doesn't just affect them. It doesn't just affect their relationship with their God. Now, the Old Testament says it affects their relationship with everyone, and therefore the world's relationship with God. It affects his plan for worldwide redemption. And so there is a focus on keeping the law, on ethical living as it is laid out in the Old Testament, but it's also there in the stories and the Psalms and the histories and the wisdom literature. And I reckon, that's an unusual thought, but I reckon one of the benefits for Israel in the giving of the law is that it put ethical living within the reach of every Israelite. Because you knew what was right and wrong. You didn't have to imagine it for yourself. You didn't have to come up with some scheme for determining good or evil in your own home. No, it was written down. And so Micah 6, verse 8, says, he has shown you, O man, what is good. Want to know what is good? Well, there it is. That's why in passages like Deuteronomy chapter 6, you might want to flip to this one, Deuteronomy chapter 6, from verse 4. I can stop flipping, but flipping's good. Get to see that what I'm saying is actually there by reading big chunks. Find where things are. Hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Deuteronomy 6 verse 4 says, listen, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. These words that I am giving to you today are to be in your heart. Repeat them to your children. Talk about them when you sit in your house and when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand. The modern equivalent would be tattoo them, I guess. You might know there's a off script, there's a UFC fighter, current UFC middleweight champ, I think, John Bones Jones, who has Philippians 4:18 tattooed in big letters across his chest. Anyone know Philippians 4:18? I can do all things through God who gives me strength. Imagine seeing that as he lies on top of you, smashing the face. I'm not sure that's what the passage had in mind. But it says, bind them as a sign on your hand, tie them as a symbol on your forehead. Right? And you may see very Orthodox Jews in Israel doing that, having little boxes with bits of the Old Testament written inside and strapped to their heads. Write them on the doorposts of your house. The modern equivalent is to tapestry it and have it in your kitchen. Right?
No. Do what the bloke in the movie does.
I don't know what the bloke in the movie does, Beck.
Did you not see the sign? There's a big sign, love the neighbours.
Oh, I have seen that, yes. Write them on your doorposts of your house and on your city gates, it says. It's why Deuteronomy 31 commands that the whole law be read to the whole people every 7 years. It's why the questions and the answers are laid out for repetition every Passover, when the families gather together and they're given a script, right?
And they've got a special box on each door of their home with the scripture inside as well.
Behind your doorpost. And so, ask the kids to ask, why are we eating this? Right? And it's not a joke that the dad says every year, it's actually a chance to explain again, to retell the old story, to set the theological groundwork for why Israel lives the way it does. Why do we do this? Well, because God redeemed us from Israel, from Egypt, out of slavery. And it's important. It's important because Old Testament ethics aren't just about Israel's relationship with God, but they actually reflect his nature to the world. What God is like is intended to be seen in what the people are like. So if you want a phone flip or a page flip to Jeremiah 9, Jeremiah, the big fat prophets in the back of the Old Testament. Jeremiah 9 verse 23. This is what the Lord says. The wise person should not boast in his wisdom. The strong person should not boast in his strength. The wealthy should not boast in his wealth. But the one who boasts should boast in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord, showing faithful love, justice, and righteousness on the earth. For I delight in these things. This is Yahweh's declaration. And so he says, knowing God means doing righteousness and justice and showing mercy and showing compassion, but not only doing it, but knowing that God delights in these things. That is, it's not an arbitrary commandment from a God who is unlike this. It's not do what I say, not what I do. But rather, the person who does right, who boasts that they not only do good, but they know that that is something that God delights in because that is what God is like. Israel's ethics, therefore, are meant to reflect not only God's instruction, but God's character. So that when they go after other gods, as the Old Testament displays the nation doing time and again, like when Israel chases after the gods of the nations, they actually end up with different ethics, with different behaviours. Right? Different God, different understanding of right and wrong. And our world wants to say it doesn't matter what religion you follow, right, as long as you're nice. Our postmodern ethics. It doesn't matter what path you take up the mountain to get to the happiness, right? As long as you don't hurt anybody on the way, we all end up in the same place. That's what we want to say. But the Old Testament clearly shows that all religions, they don't produce the same good living. They don't produce the same ethic. You want to follow the god Moloch in the Old Testament? Well, his ethic involves child sacrifice. Israel, you bring the first of your crops. You bring an unblemished lamb. In Moloch, you bring your child. Huh? The ethics of Astarte involved ritual prostitution. You worship the goddess. You go to the temple, you pay your money, you sleep with the the priestess at the temple, and you will have fertility for your farm because you've sown your seed. Is that the kind of ethic, the kind of world that you want to live in? Different God, different ethic, different understanding of right and wrong. It's not for nothing that the Old Testament prophets condemn idolatry as adultery. Link them together often. Well, how should we summarise what we've thought about this session? I want to give you 6 loose points. Very quick ones. Firstly, doing ethics is thinking about how we should live. It's how we decide what thoughts, what actions, what conditions are right and wrong. That's what ethics is. It doesn't have to be scary. It's just how we think about right and wrong. Secondly, one way of approaching Old Testament ethics is to think about it as a triangle, with a theological, a social and an economic lens by which to view what's happening in the passage and what's happening in the Old Testament as a whole. Thirdly, the crucial point of the theological angle of Old Testament ethics is that it is fundamentally God-centered. It is about who Yahweh is in his character and then in his actions. It presupposes his initiative before his instruction. That is, he acts and then he calls people to respond. Fourthly, Israel is to model Yahweh's character to the nations. In effect, they are to be holy because he is holy. Fifthly, the Old Testament law is there to instruct them on how to do this. And following a different God, therefore, will involve different ways of living, a different ethic. And sixthly, it's not only the laws in the Old Testament that demonstrate this. The entire Old Testament helps us to understand who God is and how he wants us to live. And we're going to, I think we might, explore how those Old Testament ethics help us live as Christians rather than pre-Christ Jews. But I hope you can see the obvious parallels in what we've already looked at. Particularly in how salvation as a Christian is not based on what we do, on merit, but rather on God's love to us in Jesus before there was any relationship, before we could do anything good that might cause him to act towards us in good. It's the same as the Exodus, right? God loved us, acted towards us in grace in Jesus, and then calls us to respond.
Could you just do those 6 just really quickly again? I just in a couple of words.
Sure.
Sorry, is that okay?
That's okay.
Yes.
First one is that ethics is just thinking about how we should live, deciding on right and wrong. The second one is the Old Testament, the triangle of ethics, so theological, social and economic angles. Third one is that the crucial part of the theological angle is God-centered. It's who God is, it's about who God is and his character. The fourth one is that Israel is to model that character to the nations, holy because he is holy. Sixthly, Old Testament, the law is there to instruct them on how to live that out. How do you show the nations that God is holy? And therefore following a different God means different ethics. And sixthly is it's not only the law that tells us that. So we don't just find out what God is like and how we should live by reading the laws, particularly those numbers and all the places where Bible reading plans go to die, right? The later chapters of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers. And if you get through that, you're on a home, you can get to April and you're in the final stretch, right? You get past those. But, yeah. And another parallel for us, I think, is in the way that Christian ethics are also based in the character of God, right? As Christians, we think about Jesus first loved us, therefore we love him and we act in the way that he asks us to. In response, we try and be like him in the way the Israelites tried to live out what Yahweh was like among the nations. 1 John tells us that, love one another because I first loved you. And it's also true, I think, that if we follow a different Jesus from the one the New Testament presents to us, we'll end up with a different Christianity. And I think some of us look at some churches and think, well, yeah, I can tell by the things that you teach, the way that you live, that the Jesus you follow is not the one that's in here. Worshipping a different God always leads to different ethics. we'll wrap up really quickly, not with me talking, but with you talking again. You might ask your neighbour 2 very simple questions. Is there something you learned or were reminded of as we've talked about this stuff? Is there something that wasn't clear and you would like Simon to clear up for you later? Is it something you learned or were reminded of? Is it something that wasn't clear or you still have questions about? That might be a better way to put it. Thank you.